Welcome to our training on arsenic awareness. OSHA requires inorganic arsenic training whenever employees are exposed to arsenic at or above the action level. The action level is defined by OSHA as 1/2 of the permissible exposure limit, or PEL. Employees need to understand the possible health effects related to inorganic arsenic and how to reduce and/or eliminate the exposures that can lead to these health effects. When do we need inorganic arsenic training? OSHA requires inorganic arsenic training prior to working in a regulated area and annually thereafter. A regulated area is defined as an area where exposure to arsenic is above the OSHA permissible exposure limit. What subjects need to be covered to meet the OSHA requirement? According to OSHA, each of the following topics must be covered: health hazards, permissible exposure limit, or PEL, personal protective equipment, or PPE, the location of regulated areas, signs and labels, hygiene facilities, engineering controls, medical surveillance, and housekeeping. Health hazards. Health effects are possible if you breathe or ingest inorganic arsenic. Fly ash contains varying amounts of this naturally occurring metal. Inhalation is the most likely route of exposure, but ingestion is also possible. The likelihood of developing inorganic arsenic-related health effects is directly related to the frequency at which personnel are exposed to concentrations that are above the PEL. OSHA requires that physicals be offered for anyone who spends more than 30 days per year in a regulated area. Permissible exposure limit, or PEL. For inorganic arsenic, the OSHA PEL is 10 micrograms per cubic meter. This means that the average person can be exposed to 10 micrograms per cubic meter for 8 hours a day, 40 hours a week, without adverse health effects. Any work area having greater than 10 micrograms per cubic meter must be established as a regulated area. The PEL refers to airborne concentrations of inorganic arsenic. How much inorganic arsenic is 10 micrograms per cubic meter? Air sampling equipment is necessary to identify how much inorganic arsenic is present in the air. There are many factors that influence the airborne concentration, and it is not possible to determine the concentration without air sampling and lab analysis. Here's a brain teaser for you. OSHA requires inorganic arsenic training whenever personnel are exposed to arsenic at or above the action level. A, true, B, false. A regulated area is defined as an area where exposure to arsenic is below the OSHA permissible exposure limit. A, true, B, OSHA requires that medical evaluations be offered for anyone who spends more than blank days per year in a regulated area. A, 21 days. B, 90 days. C, 45 days. For inorganic arsenic, the OSHA PEL is blank. A, 5 micrograms. Personal protective equipment. Respiratory protection is used to protect personnel from inhaling inorganic arsenic. Other PPE, such as coveralls and gloves, are used to help keep the fly ash within the regulated area and off your skin. Respirators can be easily cleaned to remove any fly ash, but coveralls need to be laundered. As a result, coveralls, gloves, and other similar PPE must be removed prior to leaving the regulated area. The coveralls used in regulated areas should be distinguishable from coveralls used for other purposes. Personal protective equipment and the permissible exposure limit. The correct use of an air purifying or particulate respirator will effectively reduce the amount of inorganic arsenic you are exposed to. Fly ash and welding or grinding air sampling data that dates back to 1990 has not identified workplace concentrations that exceed the protection limits of a half-mask air purifying respirator or APR. Your specific workplace exposure concentrations can be validated by air sampling. The correct use of a respirator is key to ensuring that personnel are protected from the potential health effects. The coveralls and gloves used during regulated work activities are used as a protective outer layer that can be removed prior to leaving the regulated area. This ensures that inorganic arsenic is kept from contaminating normally unregulated areas. Personal protective equipment and the permissible exposure limit. The correct use of an air purifying or particulate respirator will effectively reduce the amount of inorganic arsenic you are exposed to. Fly ash and welding or grinding air sampling data that dates back to 1990 has not identified workplace concentrations that exceed the protection limits of a half-mask air purifying respirator or APR. Your specific workplace exposure concentrations can be validated by air sampling. The correct use of a respirator is key to ensuring that personnel are protected from the potential health effects. The coveralls and gloves used during regulated work activities are used as a protective outer layer that can be removed prior to leaving the regulated area. This ensures that inorganic arsenic is kept from contaminating normally unregulated areas. Regulated areas. A regulated area is defined as an area where exposures to arsenic are above the OSHA permissible exposure limit. Use air sampling to determine the areas that should be treated as regulated. Examples of regulated areas may include boilers and boiler rooms, a furnace and its surrounding areas, any ductwork and stacks from a furnace, air preheaters, airflow wind boxes, ventilation penthouses, and any bag houses, ash hoppers, or silos. Regulated areas, welding, cutting, and grinding. Welding, cutting, and grinding on fireside boiler components and similar equipment involved in the combustion of coal may result in personal exposures greater than 10 micrograms per cubic meter and are generally considered regulated jobs. Under these conditions, the inorganic arsenic is not in the form of ash and therefore cannot be washed or vacuumed off the boiler components or similar equipment. The high boiler temperatures cause the inorganic arsenic to plate out onto the boiler components. Typical air sampling data indicate that there are no significant exposure concerns at a distance of 6 feet or greater from these activities. Proper industrial hygiene air sampling must be used to determine exact exposure potentials. Let's try an activity to see what you've learned so far. Fill in the blanks by clicking and dragging the correct words to the sentences. Signs and labels. OSHA requires that signs be posted to identify all regulated work areas. These signs must read as follows: danger, inorganic arsenic, cancer hazard, authorized personnel only, no smoking or eating, respirator required. Hygiene facilities. If you work in a regulated area, OSHA requires that you be provided with hygiene facilities. These facilities are provided so that personnel can wash their hands and face before eating and or drinking, and for showering after the work shift. Under no circumstances is it acceptable to eat or drink in a regulated area. Good hygiene practices before breaks and at the end of your shift will ensure that exposure to inorganic arsenic is kept to a minimum. OSHA also requires that personnel be provided a place to eat meals that is removed from any regulated area. Engineering controls, fly ash. As with any other health or safety-related activity, it is always best to remove the hazard prior to starting the job. Inorganic arsenic is no different. For example, a regulated area can be reclassified as unregulated if the fly ash can be removed by vacuuming using an industrial vacuum equipped with a HEPA filter or washing. The cleaning process may or may not be a regulated activity, but it is best to treat it as regulated until air sampling shows that it is not. Proper PPE must be worn during the cleaning process. Engineering controls, welding, grinding, cutting. For regulated jobs such as welding on the fireside boiler components, the task of removing the inorganic arsenic is not simple. The arsenic metal actually gets plated out on the boiler components. As a result, it's not reasonably possible to remove the inorganic arsenic prior to welding, grinding, or cutting. Medical surveillance. The inorganic arsenic regulation requires the use of engineering controls and PPE to protect personnel who must enter a regulated area. If the engineering controls and PPE are used correctly, there is no reason to be concerned about inorganic arsenic-related health effects. In order to ensure effective personal protection, OSHA also requires that the employer implement a medical surveillance program. It is your responsibility to fill out a contamination exposure time report form for every shift that you enter a regulated area. Personnel exceeding 30 days per year or 240 hours in a regulated area will be offered a medical examination. Contact your supervisor if you have any questions. Housekeeping. Keeping the work area free of any ash accumulation can reduce or even eliminate the potential for overexposure. Housekeeping can control ash accumulation, but to be effective, housekeeping must occur periodically. The following areas should be considered. Surfaces. Keep surfaces free of fly ash. Vacuuming. HEPA vacuums in good working order should be used during cleanup. It's important to ensure that the vacuum is not reintroducing the material back into the work area. Maintenance of equipment. Equipment leaks that introduce fly ash into the workplace should be repaired as soon as feasibly possible. Here's a brain teaser for you. OSHA requires that personnel be provided a place to eat meals that is removed from any regulated area. A, true. B, OSHA does not require that the employer implement a medical surveillance program for employees who work in a regulated area. Personnel exceeding 30 days per year, 240 hours, in a regulated area will be offered a medical examination. Conclusion. You have learned about the health hazards, permissible exposure limits, and PPE requirements for inorganic arsenic. We've also covered regulated areas, signs and labels, hygiene facilities, engineering controls, medical surveillance, and housekeeping requirements. Exposure potential to inorganic arsenic can be minimized or eliminated through proper engineering controls and the use of PPE. All regulated areas identified by personal air monitoring fall under OSHA's inorganic arsenic standard unless the exposure potential can be removed. Be sure to document the amount of time you spend in regulated areas following your organization's policies and procedures. Contact your supervisor if you need further information. This concludes our overview on inorganic arsenic.